All right, everyone. Welcome to our next AIH seminar series. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, Michael Frank, who is, unlike our previous academic philosophers, is AI entrepreneur and think tank fellow, focusing on geopolitics and AI. So some of his work has been featured in venues like The Economist, and The Diplomat and CIS. And today, he's going to talk to us about strategic determinism, the limitations of governments in shaping AI development. So please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in Hong Kong. I lived here from 2016 to 22. I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit when I was based here. And it's always a pleasure to come back to Hong Kong. So thank you very much for having me. My talk, as Frank alluded to, will skew more towards the realm of geopolitics and the relationship between the United States and China. But I think this will be somewhat of a funny talk, or at least I hope it will be, because I think there's a high degree of irony in this relationship. And so what we'll talk through here is these three points: what matters for AI, policy priorities, and in both countries, and the impact on AI capability. And three is looking at factor endowments for AI, but really it's the question of who's winning the competition or who will win. But the reason I say I think this is kind of a funny topic is because this is such a paramount focus in both countries. The relationship, the strategic competition, and AI and technology's role in that competition more broadly. And yet, both countries are doing very counterproductive things in terms of bolstering their AI capability. Of course, this is not a new concept in international relations. You see countries do this all the time. Recently, Russia invaded Ukraine with the goal of preventing the eastward expansion of NATO and even potentially rolling back the borders of NATO further west. What happened? Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, and Ukraine is probably going to join NATO after the war ends. Donald Trump becomes president in 2017, and one of his top economic and international relations priorities is reducing the trade deficit with China. 4 years later, at the end of his first term, what happens? US record trade deficit with China. So this is actually, I think in making this case, my hope is I have a very easy case to make to you that these things happen all the time. And the takeaway, I hope, will be some reflection on why are these countries doing this, or what's the reason for the inaction? I think there's some very interesting political economic questions to ask about both countries based on this topic. So starting with what matters for AI, actually just shout out some factors. Would love to hear from you all. What are some of the factors that are important for AI if you think at the micro level? Data, exactly, yep. Chips. Yep, computing power, yep. Talent, yes. Algorithms. Energy, yep. Money. Regulations. Cheap labor, maybe expensive labor too, but yes, cheap labor. Those are all things that I'm starting with in my abstract model here. I think those are all, without a doubt, important inputs in doing AI, either if you're doing research or you're working in a company, or at the macro level, if you're responsible for society-wide, economy-wide AI development. And so I've tried to kind of break this very rudimentary model into the group of AI inputs. And this is, if show of hands, anyone take any economics courses? Yeah. This will look familiar as sort of your standard production model where you have human capital or labor, and then you break capital into AI hardware, computing capital, and financial capital. This is a fairly standard production model. And then the way you combine these is that's your technology. Again, this is kind of orthodox economics. There's then this process to go from these inputs on a micro level to an AI capability at the macro level for a whole country, for a whole economy. And I'm going to be talking today in terms of diffusion. So we have AI research at the frontier, moving the frontier forward. But then we have diffusion, which is getting people, businesses, researchers to use those technologies. This is already, I think, this is an abstraction, which makes it difficult to monitor this equilibrium. We're going to make it even more complicated. We think about, there are market pressures and governance pressures on every aspect of this diagram. The market and governance regulation can affect, these inputs. It can affect how you combine them in terms of technology, and it can affect the diffusion piece. So this is really a dynamic equilibrium, and it's really tough to just isolate the impact of, one input or one technology. But we'll do our best working with this simple model. So I think it's important too, as we get further down this AI evolution, to think of some of these inputs a little bit more holistically. So starting with human capital, talent, we talked about talent, labor. I think you break this up by looking at AI researchers who are doing the theoretical AI, the research frontier. But then you also have applied AI and engineers and developers. Yeah, as Frank mentioned, I lead an AI startup. We do geopolitical risk. We have a platform. A significant amount of what we do is pre-AI. These are well-established software techniques like web scraping, up to sort of the pre-generative AI machine learning packages that are still pretty somewhat cutting edge. But a lot of actually using AI happens in this box with this talent pool of engineers and developers who are capable of pulling together the full stack. You also have the importance of this will kill the top two groups that I bring this up, but I think it's to acknowledge you do need commercial leaders, people who are either entrepreneurs, or if you're in an established business, you can lead this intelligent transformation effort to make your business smarter and use AI. Commercial leaders, that's definitely a discrete skill set. And then investors, in terms of financing AI, picking winners and losers in early stage companies, you've got to make bets on what AI is going to look like, which companies will be successful. That's also very much a unique skill set. And even the best investors in the world, they might make 20 investments, 19 of them go to zero, but one goes to a number quite a bit larger than zero to make up for the loss. Breaking down financial capital, more is always better in terms of money. This isn't, this business, it's not charity. But I think it's interesting to break down these different types of money because you do see differences across countries. R&D is definitely important, and I think both the United States and China do very well in terms of R&D capital and investment that helps to push the frontier forward. You have angels and venture capital that's investing in early stage companies. That's sort of that immediate next link between the theoretical research and commercializing the technology. You have the intelligent transformation, as I mentioned, established companies that are trying to implement AI in their existing business, and then thinking of capital markets as the ultimate arbiter of we think these companies are doing well and these are not. And when the story is written on AI in the future, the capital markets will have played the decisive role in elevating the big winner, the winners, and killing off the losers, just like happens with sort of every technological wave. Another input here, we talked about compute, AI hardware, very, very important. The trend is generally towards bigger is better. And this is a chart from Epoch AI of some of the recent trends in training models. And you can see most of these are large language models, this sort of these teal dots are language models. But you also have orange for multimodal. You have speech models like Whisper, a product from OpenAI. You have games like AlphaGo Zero from DeepMind, biology models, vision models. But in general, clearly the trend is bigger is better, even for models that might have fewer numbers of parameters. So sometimes we refer to them as smaller models. The training compute is still actually going up. And a good example of that is this Llama 2 model from Meta has 70 billion parameters. That's what the 70B refers to. And the first one, let's see, this Llama 2 70B model was trained in sort of mid-2023. There is now a new Llama 2 new Llama model that also has 70 billion parameters, focused more on code. Same number of parameters, but you can see we're moving up in terms of compute. And so even though not everybody is trying to train the massive GPT-4, trillion parameter models, there is this trend. And so when we talk about inputs that are important, compute is very, very important. This focuses on training, but it's also important to remember that inference is very compute intensive as well. Anytime you send in a query through ChatGPT, or if you use WhatsApp to query a Llama model, or even if you're running one of those models on your own machine, that's not totally free, right? You do have to run hardware to actually process that inference. So I'll break down market forces and governance forces in a little bit different way and sort some kind of indicative forces here in terms of their, what their stimulative effect might be or depressive effect. And starting with use cases, you can think about, what do you want if your goal is to diffuse AI throughout your economy? Well, you want well-defined use cases. And this is something that, especially in the startup community, is really, really important. They talk about finding product market fit. Like, you want something that people actually understand why this is useful, and will use it because it's relevant to their life, not just because it's sweet tech. The depressive analog of this is poorly defined or vague use cases, right? Consumer compatibility. I think a huge point here is having interest, but also trust. And we'll talk a bit more towards the end about the role of AI safety and assurance, but consumers have to trust that the model that they're using, or if there's a product that has AI in the back end, they have to believe that their privacy is going to be protected, and it's not going to at the extreme end, it's not going to ruin their life by making some faulty judgment about their credit history or make a decision about their health or welfare. This is a really important piece in terms of market forces that I think is underappreciated, both in the private sector and in government right now. But we'll talk more about that later. This seems like a really basic thing, but you do need people to pay for these products, right? Here I use customers instead of consumers because it doesn't necessarily have to be a product marketed to consumers. So I assume, does everybody use Google Maps? Right? Yeah. Has anyone ever paid for Google Maps? Yeah, yeah. But they have a clear business model where they charge advertising, right? So they had to figure that out. But if Google came to us today and was like, well, we're gonna now sell you a subscription, $10 a month to use our Maps app, like I doubt any of us would use it. We'd probably switch to a product where it continues to be free, and they have that advertising model. But that's something that's really important is, again, in terms of finding this product market fit, products that people actually pay for. And finally, returns. I always come back to, maybe this is apocryphal, but the quote from Deng Xiaoping that, you know, some people are going to have to get rich. You want there to be at the macro level the opportunity for lucrative returns, and that reflects both, you know, if we get this right, what is sort of the total market that we could potentially acquire, but also that we get to keep those gains, that the government's not going to come in and either cap what we earn or block us from realizing those gains in some way. So I think all of these four factors, you can also think about this in terms of governance. And you know, it's, I think, not always entirely straightforward. It's not just a matter of government having their hands off. Like in some cases, the stimulative effect is more regulation. And one example there is consumer compatibility. You want regulation that reinforces consumer trust and interest. And if you let the AI companies and companies that are building AI-enabled products and services write their own rules on safety and bias and discrimination, that's not going to enhance consumer compatibility, right? So actually, you know, in this case, the stimulative governance force is having that proactive regulatory approach rather than just staying out. So I think there are some cases where, you know, in terms of use cases and willingness to pay, you do want the, you know, within reason, the government should be more hands off. You know, I say, for example, with use cases with limits, you know, nobody that I talk to in the AI policy community seems to think it's a good idea that we would, you know, totally open source models that have not had any restrictions or safety processes in place for developing biological weapons or chemical weapons, for example. You know, people don't want that to just be out there. So. But within reason, you do want the government to let the market play that role. So just to come back to this before we talk a bit more about, you know, the irony of what both countries are doing, just to revisit this model, it's, you know, it's starting with these inputs. It's how you combine them to the technology is how you finish out your production function, and then diffusing that through the entire economy. That's what's really important here. And a reminder that everything you see here exists in equilibrium where, you know, market forces can influence governance forces, which can influence inputs, so on and so forth. So we get to the irony. What are the United States and China actually doing to enhance their AI capability? Does anyone recognize this chart? This is a fairly well-established chart, Everett Rogers' theory of the diffusion of innovations. And your x-axis here is time. We've labeled these cohorts here, but if you think as you move from left to right through a technological evolution, you start at the beginning, and sort of over here to the left of where the chart begins is, you know, that's the research frontier. And then when you start to commercialize the technology, you might have, you know, 2.5% of companies, you know, the numbers are not important, but think of it as an extraordinarily small number of companies are true innovators. So for AI, it might be a company like NVIDIA, which has been at the forefront of, especially for compute, but also developing a lot of models themselves, and they're really at the cutting edge. Then you have your next group, these early adopters. I think of a company like Apple, which typically waits to see whether technologies are successful elsewhere before commercializing them. But then you get to, this huge block in the middle, right? And kind of an arbitrary distinction of early majority versus late majority. But now we're moving past just technology companies and looking at banks and hospitals and energy companies, right? Moving to throughout the whole economy, spreading a technology as it gains, consumer buy-in and clear use cases and healthy regulation. That's where you really get the majority of diffusion. And then finally, you always have some laggards. I thought it was interesting. I lived in Hong Kong at the beginning of the pandemic. I'd heard an anecdote of a lot of, there were still probably like 10 or 15% of companies that would insist on paper invoices, despite the fact that, there were all these controls. They're trying to move away from human contact and say, can we just send you an email? And 10 to 15% of companies say, no, we have to have that paper. What if I lose your email, and I don't have a record of business? There's always going to be people like that, but at some point, the idea is if this is a true technological evolution, at some point you have total diffusion. The key point here that in terms of how I'm going to analyze the competition is really about diffusion rather than the absolute research capability. And happy to talk about that in the Q&A, go into more detail about why that's the case. But I would also recommend, if you haven't read it and you're interested, Jeffrey Ding, who's a professor at George Washington, has done some great work on this topic. He has a book that's just come out about the role of technology in great power competition. And he really focuses on diffusion rather than that top line national innovation capability. I think one good reason for that focus is because a lot of this technology is open source, and these research communities are in constant communication with one another. So things tend to spread between that sort of elite research community very, very quickly. So this competition is, and Frank mentioned earlier, this might be kind of a downer. This is where the talk is going to get kind of grim for a few minutes, because you have a dual use technology like AI, and I think of it as a spectrum of, on the far right is things that we see, even though it's a dual use technology, clearly a military non-civilian use of this technology, like autonomous weapons systems, right? And moving to the left is kind of moving away from, clear cut, yes, this is a military capability, towards, well, how do you define something like broad semiconductor manufacturing, as opposed to just semiconductors for weapon systems, semiconductors for not just for cloud to run AI models, but for refrigerators or cars or anything with an on-off switch, right? And at the far left end of the spectrum is this sort of all-encompassing view of, well, anything that enhances our country's economic capability is strategic because we are in this all-out competition. And the question of where we draw the line, the United States and China have elected not to draw the line. So Chinese policy dating back over the last 10 years has been very clear, consistent, that all of these aspects and applications of AI are strategic in nature. And US policy, I would say, kind of lagged that view until the last couple of years. But starting with the export controls moved further into this area as well. We see this take this broader view. And then finally, last week, the White House released this national security memo that focuses on AI applications to really broaden out the US view of the competition with China to be all-encompassing. And the small yard, high fence approach to US policymaking with respect to China is turning into a big yard. And I think there's then a question of, well, if you're going to take that broad view, are you actually making good policy? if you're saying we have to cover every aspect of the AI value chain, because everything, whether it's it's dual use, everything is a threat, and anything that enhances underlying economic capability of our adversary is a threat. You would think policy would then touch each of these aspects of the AI value chain. In practice, the vast majority of policy effort is focused on AI hardware. It's focused on chips in both countries. That's not to say there aren't efforts on other policies that touch other aspects of this. To some extent, the U.S. has been playing around with financial capital, but there aren't really robust financial capital ties between the countries right now on AI, because investors have anticipated this for a while. But the key point here is the vast majority is focused on AI hardware to the neglect of all of these other areas. So on these next two slides, I've kind of put together this sort of stoplight system with, this is not meant to be comprehensive, but just some examples of, based on each of these factors, what would be a pro-AI policy. We think back to a few slides ago, something stimulative, either for a governance force or market force. And green is meant to represent, actually, yeah, policy there is pretty good. It's largely stimulative. Yellow is meant to be neutral, or maybe there's some positive aspects, some negative or general neglect. And then red is these are actually depressive effects on AI development. You could make a case that this whole grid should be green. These are not like impossible pipe dream type policies. So for a liberal immigration policy, for example, the U.S. approach is a shambles. I mean, I don't think any reasonable person would argue that the U.S. immigration system is not broken. And the U.S.'s ability to attract and retain significant foreign talent is despite the policy failures of the immigration system rather than because of it. Similarly with China, there has been a really positive trend towards world-class researchers who maybe are from China originally, have studied abroad, returning to China. But the long-term trend over the last few years is of foreigners leaving, which again, that's not the trend you want. You want to be, if you're serious about this competition, one of the best things you can do is attract world-leading talent. You need to reverse that negative trend, right? Same with flexible labor markets. There are a few of these that I think are more environmental policies that actually benefit a lot of different businesses or research applications. They're, for example, in the U.S., generally pretty flexible labor markets. It's relatively easy to hire and fire people in the U.S. And they're also, there's a pretty robust union ecosystem. More, not in every state. There are some states that effectively ban unions, but in a lot of cases, the labor market's quite strong. But there's just zero coordination on this issue, which is really key for AI diffusion, to think about what's the labor that we need to develop AI, and then how is AI going to affect the labor market? And there's basically no organized thinking in the federal government on that question. And China, for its part, with labor markets, this is kind of an enduring problem, very inflexible labor markets, and it's not specific to AI, but it's a challenge of the ecosystem. I won't go through all of these in detail. We could always come back to this in the conversation if you're interested in any particular one. But my key takeaway on this slide, and I'll show a little bit of market force in the next slide, is again, there's not really a good reason why you can't light up this full table in green. These are not really complicated policies to implement. Looking at market forces, again, this is not a good picture, right? Government procurement of AI. U.S. has said this is a goal. The AI executive order calls for procurement of AI products and capabilities in the government, but there's a huge divergence across federal agencies in terms of their ability and willingness to actually do this. So in China, you have the primary focus in terms of procurement of AI is actually in swapping out Western technology right now, rather than thinking about a very intentional effort to get AI into the government. AI safety is really a critical thing. Again, to come back to the consumer compatibility point, you want people to feel that AI is safe. If you are pro-market, you're pro-diffusion, you have to take AI safety seriously, and there needs to be regulations that encourage that and validate that belief in consumers. And this is something I think there's a lot of talk about. There is interest in both countries, but there's not action yet. And I think that could be something we talk about later, is what could you actually do at this stage that goes beyond sort of these feeler measures that have been put out so far in establishing the AI safety institutes. The US has centralized that in the RAND Corporation. China is in the process of centralizing maybe 4 or 5 different institutions that are doing technical evaluations and research and setting up standards. And then just a general point too. Again, it's tempting. I noticed this a lot in the research and think tank community to get into these like really specific, hyper technical policy aspects of AI, like semiconductor export controls, which is very fun and intellectually rewarding to think about that. But one of the things that's really important is just, do people have money to invest in development of this technology and then buy the products? And the U.S. actually, despite what, you talk to Americans about the economy and they say it's terrible, the U.S. is the best performing advanced economy in the world the last few years. People don't believe it, but that's actually a really positive stimulative force for the development of AI. And China is definitely struggling. It's still at the beginning of this long-term deleveraging trend. There is still plenty of money this is just one piece. You also have government budgets where China has much deeper pockets than what Chinese consumers and corporates have right now. But taking that more holistic view of all of the inputs that go into AI, I think is really important, and neither country is doing a good job of that right now. So just with the next few minutes before we open it up, and we'd love to hear your questions, get into a bit of discussion, I figured I would present a bit of an overview of, well, how is this competition going? And if you buy into the argument, maybe you don't, but if you buy into the argument that actually policy is not really determining who's winning the competition right now, I think it's interesting to look at the endowments that both these countries are starting with that might indicate the potential that if policy was uniformly stimulative, what policymakers essentially have to work with in terms of the underlying inputs in their countries. And this is really not meant to be comprehensive. I've tried to pick out some examples that I think are really critical, but might serve as proxies for a bigger discussion. So if you think about human capital, U.S. does have a dominant pool of elite AI researchers despite its terrible immigration system. This metric here is from Macro Polo. They're a think tank based in Chicago. They measured the share of papers selected for oral presentations at NeurIPS, which is the leading AI conference. And this generally has about a 2% acceptance rate. So this is of the elite who are trying to get into this conference. It's the less than 2% are accepted to actually present. So the top of the top, that's this group. And you can definitely see, you could interpret this chart, I think, a couple of different ways. One is, you look at 2019, China is at least less than 3% in 2019, and by 2022, it's up to 12, right? So that's very rapid growth for China. That's a very positive story. But another way of interpreting this is if you look at the US, 57% down from 65, this is a commanding position, right, to be in. You would much rather be in the US's position here than China's position, but China's clearly catching up. This is the next 18% of AI researchers. This might not be fair to that group to say that they're not as important as the top tier, but again, thinking about that, the breakdown of human capital, yes, you need elite researchers, but you also need more, full stack engineers and more research talent that can take maybe the cutting edge stuff, but then think about how do we apply this in, a specific context, and they can be sort of the go between that cutting edge research and more applied AI. It's still a really important group, and this is a metric that China does very, very well on. And again, massive growth between 2019 and 22. It's, I think the key takeaway here too is, maybe in 2019, US is number one, and there's a case to be made for who is number two. I think, now it's clear that China and the US are the two leading AI talent countries in the world. This is something that I thought was an interesting proxy for sort of that entrepreneurship and financial, the investment group of talent is willingness to fail. This really is a critical part of entrepreneurship because you are probably going to fail. So you've got to be able to live with that. And I think this is fascinating. If you look, this data set goes back almost 25 years, and China. Look at China in 2005. China's fearless in 2005, right? And now up here, this fear of failure rate is not on a good trajectory. And I think there's some really interesting interpretations of that you could look at demographics or the health of the economy or broader sociocultural shifts. But this gap has not existed this large with the exception of 2015. I actually think this is more of an outlier, but this gap does appear to be opening up between the US and China for this sort of entrepreneurial class that's going to be important for commercializing AI. And then, yeah, if you didn't believe me, that connection, this is, if you look at total early stage entrepreneurial activity, this is the share of the population who are either a nascent entrepreneur or starting a new business. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an AI business, but you can see a pretty sizable gap here. This will be really interesting to track, I think, over the next few years, both of these two charts combined. I apologize in advance, these next two slides. I love OECD.ai. They have a great data set. For whatever reason, they wouldn't let me change the color of these these data series, so bear with me because it gets a little wonky. We have the US in blue, China in orange here. But this is a series looking at venture capital investments in AI, and this is cumulative. So, which makes sense if you were, make an investment in an AI company, it's in one quarter. It's not like that money just disappears the next quarter. It then is getting spent over this subsequent, maybe 8 quarters. These investments typically, 2 to 3 year timelines, not unusual. So that's a good point, a good case for making it cumulative. Until recently, you can see here is 2019, 2020 right there. China was definitely closing the gap. And I think part of this story is maybe American VCs going to China, and that has ended over the last few years. But now this gap is huge and maybe growing. And for generative AI, it's even more pronounced. And here's where I say this is getting wonky. For whatever reason, now the US is orange and China's blue, so I apologize. But this is just an astoundingly large gap. This is definitely where all the action is in AI right now. That's not to say that other aspects of AI that are more industrial focused aren't important too, but this is the hottest area in AI, and this gap is I mean, that's insurmountable. when you think about how, how many more years we have in this cycle, there's just not enough time to close this gap. So this is really, I thought this was shocking. I thought it was an error when I first looked at it. Now we're back to US blue, China orange. But China was leading with venture capital investments in AI compute startups, more on the hardware front until recently. But even there, now the US has caught back up. You have huge AI, US industrial policy and this big concerted push both from the government and from the private sector to should we pause? Oh, no, wait. No, are we good? Oh, is it off? Should we go for it? Try it? The AI wants to stop you. Yeah, apparently I've touched on something sensitive, maybe. I will wrap up in case that we can continue the conversation outside if we have to. But yeah, this is interesting, I think, because this is an area where China has historically done very, very well, more in the industrial application, manufacturing, and the U.S. venture capital investments are just skyrocketing there as well. I wanted to at least pull a couple of anecdotes. It's really, really hard right now to understand how consumers and business leaders think about AI in both countries, partly because AI is changing so rapidly, so your views become outdated very, very quickly. So this is really anecdotal, but I figured I'd just share, something from both countries. Here is U.S. adults' view of AI from Pew Research over the last 3 years. In 2021, you can see that this sort of light gray bar here, more concerned than excited, is not a majority. It's down, 38%, 36%. Equally excited and concerned was the modal response, and fairly high number of people saying they're more excited, concerned. By 2023, we have the majority of people are more concerned than excited. That is not the direction of travel that technological evolution should be taking. And this is where, again, we come back to consumer compatibility, AI safety, regulation. This is setting off alarm bells for me. I think if you're looking at the US's ability to diffuse AI innovation, this is a problem. You should not be going this direction. You should be going the opposite direction. And consumer views can harden. So this can become even more difficult to reverse if there's not a change in the environment. This is a survey. China was even harder to find data for, but this is a survey I was part of when I was still at The Economist. And we looked at the share of businesses using AI and similar technologies. And I think this is really interesting because we talk a lot about in the Chinese economy, consumers have high familiarity with e-commerce products and are generally more tech savvy, I think, than their peers in countries at a similar level of income. China does look more like an advanced economy when it comes to its use of technology in business. And that's certainly true. It's kind of move, from top to bottom here. This is sort of increasing sophistication, right? Starting with cloud, 3/4 of businesses in China. This is for companies with more than 10 employees, by the way. So, a mom and pop shop wouldn't be covered in this survey. But still, that's a pretty high proportion of businesses that are using cloud, e-commerce. I actually thought that was a little bit low, but it's still quite high compared to other advanced economies. And AI, this is even back in 2022, I think the survey was done, and already 12.5% of businesses were using AI in some way. So I think you can, it'll be interesting to see, and potentially, great area of study if people are interested in, investigating what are consumers and businesses' attitudes towards AI. This definitely feels like kind of a blue ocean at this stage. I just figured I think the last two slides here, I just anticipate this would be a question that might come up, so I figured I'd share it now. the narrative that the U.S. sends away AI talent, I do think is overblown. The immigration system is broken. It is. I think a lot of people think it's very silly that we don't just give AI PhDs permanent residency, or at least temporary residency, to live and work in the United States when they finish at a U.S. institution. But that may be my sign to wrap it up anyway. So anyway, really quickly, I think this is just kind of an interesting one to share. And then this is something that comes up a lot: AI publications, patents, citations, pretty steady. My concluding thought is these two are clearly the most capable countries when it comes to AI in the world. It's a long jump to third place, and it is funny and ironic that they're not doing more to take advantage of that capability. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you.